"My past will ruin you," Effie Dugan said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her was shaking. She stood in the middle of James Keene's kitchen, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her dress still damp from the river crossing she had made at dawn trying to leave without waking him. The lantern on the table threw amber light across her face, and she could see the way James was looking at her. Not with the rage she expected, not with the disgust she deserved, but with something open and terribly steady. A letter sat on the table between them, crumpled at the edges where his fist had gripped it, the words inside spelling out every secret she had spent 3 years burying in Texas soil. Whoever had sent it wanted her gone. Whoever had sent it wanted James Keene to throw her out of his life before she could do what she had been slowly, helplessly doing, which was love him. "Then let it try," James said quietly. "I am not afraid." Effie felt the words hit her like a blow, not because they were cruel, because they were the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she did not know how to survive kindness. She had survived gunfighters and gamblers, and a courthouse in Abilene that had stamped her name across a trial record that still followed her like a second shadow. She had survived a man named Cole Draper, who had made her complicit in things she had never chosen, and then disappeared when the law came looking. She had survived all of it by being hard, by moving, by never letting any person get close enough to read the letter that whoever had mailed to James Keene's ranch had now made impossible to ignore. "You do not understand what is in that letter," she said. "I read every word," James said. "Twice." She looked at him, he looked back. Outside, the Texas wind came down off the caprock and pressed against the walls of the ranch house with a low, mournful sound, and somewhere in the dark, a coyote called once and went quiet. The year was 1879, and in the cattle country of West Texas, a woman's reputation was not a private matter. It was public property, discussed over telegraph lines and passed between sheriffs the way wanted posters were passed, and the things written in that letter were enough to close every door in the county to James Keene if he was associated with her. "Then you know why I am leaving," she said. "I know why you think you should," he said. "That is not the same thing." This was the moment. This was the exact edge of the cliff she had been standing on since the first week she arrived in Harlow Creek, Texas, when James Keene had offered her a position as his household manager without asking a single question about where she had come from or why her hands were calloused in the way that spoke of hard labor rather than domestic work. She had taken the job because she needed money, and because she had told herself she would be gone before anything complicated could happen. She had been wrong about the timeline, and she had been catastrophically wrong about James Keene. She had arrived in Harlow Creek in the autumn of 1878, stepping off the Southern Pacific stage with a carpetbag that held everything she owned, and a fabricated story about being a widow from San Antonio. She was not a widow. She was 26 years old and she had never been married, and the closest she had come to legal standing in a courthouse was standing in the defendant's gallery, while the man she had trusted had told a judge that she had known everything and had chosen to participate. She had not known everything. She had chosen nothing, but the record said otherwise and the record followed her. Harlow Creek was the kind of place that had not yet made up its mind about what it wanted to be. It sat on the edge of a long, flat stretch of caprock grassland where the cattle drive still pushed north, and the railroad had not yet fully arrived, though men talked about it constantly the way men talk about anything that will change everything. There was a general store owned by a man named Prout who kept the town post, and a saloon called the Gilded Spur, and a Baptist church that had been built before the saloon, but had never quite managed to outlast it in terms of attendance. There was a sheriff named Earl Bolden who was not corrupt exactly, but who was the kind of man who made his decisions based on what was easiest for Earl Bolden. And there was a cattleman named James Keene who owned the largest spread of land in 3 counties, and who was, by the time Effie arrived, the most respected man in Harlow Creek. She had met him on her second day. She had been standing outside Prout's general store reading the board where notices were tacked, and there had been a handwritten card that said, "Position available, household management and general domestic duties, Keene Ranch, 4 miles north, inquire within or ask at the store." The pay listed was generous. More generous than she expected. She had gone inside and asked Prout, and Prout had looked her up and down with the evaluating squint of a man who deals in goods, and said that James Keene was a decent man who had lost his housekeeper to a husband who had relocated to Colorado, and that she should ride out and introduce herself if she was serious. She had walked the 4 miles. The road ran through the short grass, and the sky was enormous above her, the kind of sky that felt like a judgment, wide and blue and unforgiving. She had arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon and found James Keene in the yard near the barn, working on a piece of fence line that had snapped at one of the posts. He was 32 years old, which she learned later. He was broad across the shoulders, and his face was weathered in the way of men who spend their lives outdoors, and he looked up when she walked in and did not look surprised exactly, but interested in the way a careful person is interested. "Are you the woman asking about the position?" he said. "I am," she said. "My name is Effie Dugan." He had shaken her hand, which surprised her. Men in positions like his did not always shake the hands of women applying for domestic work. Then he had asked her 3 questions. Could she manage a household budget? Could she cook for a crew of hands? And did she have any objection to hard work? She had answered yes, yes, and no in that order, and he had hired her on the spot with a trial period of 1 month. She had told herself the trial period would be enough time to move on. She had told herself she would save her pay and leave before the month was done. She had told herself a great many things that turned out to be false. The work was demanding but not punishing. The ranch ran a crew of 8 hands during the busy season and 5 in the winter, and the main house was a solid stone and timber structure that James had built himself with 2 other men over the course of 3 summers. The kitchen was large and practical, and the pantry was well stocked, and Effie fell into the rhythms of the place the way water falls into a channel. It was always meant to fill. James Keene was not a complicated man in his outward manner, but he was a thoughtful one. He ate breakfast at 5 in the morning and supper at 6 in the evening, and he was always on time, and he always said thank you, which was something Effie noticed because it was not something she had experienced as a consistent practice in any man she had known. He paid her on time. He did not ask personal questions. He did not make assumptions. She began to trust him before she meant to. The first real conversation between them happened about 3 weeks into her employment, in mid-October, when a hard frost came down early and caught some of his cattle in the south pasture, and he lost 4 animals to exposure before the hands could move the herd. She found him in the kitchen at an unusual hour, past 9 at night, when he was normally long finished with the day, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, and a look on his face that was not defeat but something close to it. She had poured him fresh coffee without asking and sat down across from him, which was probably not strictly the role of a household manager, but it felt like the right thing to do, and she had always trusted her instincts about people even when those instincts had not been enough to protect her. "A bad night," she said. "A bad week," he said. "Lost 4 head to the frost. Can the ranch carry it?" He looked at her then with something like surprise, because she had asked a practical question rather than an expression of sympathy, and she could see him recalibrating. "It can carry it," he said. "It is not the cattle that bothers me as much as the fact that I should have moved them 2 days ago. I knew the weather was turning. I waited." "You trusted your judgment and it cost you," she said. "That is different from not knowing." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "The man who does not know cannot correct anything. The man who trusted his judgment and was wrong has the information he needs for the next time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "You think about things carefully," he said. "I've had reason to," she said, and did not explain further, and he did not ask, and this was the beginning of the understanding between them that would, over the next several months, slowly and irrevocably become something neither of them had planned. The trial month passed, and James asked her if she wished to stay on indefinitely, and she said yes. She told herself this was purely practical. The pay was good, and the position was stable, and West Texas in the winter was not a time to be wandering. She told herself all of this very firmly, while she also began paying careful attention to the sound of James Keene's boots on the porch steps every evening, the particular way he said good morning, the fact that he had started leaving a small stack of whatever newspapers or periodicals came through the post on the kitchen table for her, without comment, in the way of a man who notices what a person might enjoy and simply provides it without requiring acknowledgement. By November, she was in considerable trouble, and she knew it. She did not allow herself to dwell on it. She had a dark past, and she had secrets, and she had the absolute certainty that if James Keene ever learned what she carried, he would be in his full right to send her off his land, and she would not be able to argue with the justice of it. Cole Draper's trial had been in Abilene in 1876. Her name had appeared in the testimony. She had been released without charge because there had not been enough evidence to hold her. But being released without charge was not the same as being innocent in the eyes of people who read the newspaper accounts. And Abilene was not far enough from West Texas for the stories to be entirely unfamiliar to anyone who had been paying attention during those years. She had used her own name when she arrived at Harlow Creek because she was exhausted by the cost of maintaining false ones. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in 3 years, and it was the thing that would eventually come back for her. By December, James had begun asking her opinion on things that were not strictly within the domain of household management. What did she think about the price he was being offered for a parcel of land to the east? What did she think about his foreman's suggestion to expand the herd in the spring? She gave him honest answers, and he listened, and sometimes he took her view and sometimes he didn't, but he always listened, and this was intoxicating in a way she had not expected. She had spent so many years being invisible, or worse, being visible in all the wrong ways, that the experience of being genuinely heard made something in her loosen that she had kept very carefully tightened. At Christmas, he gave her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a copy of Adam Bede by George Eliot, a novel she had mentioned in passing once as something she had read years ago and loved, and she was so surprised that she stood there holding it for a long moment without saying anything, and when she looked up at him, his expression was carefully neutral in the way of a man who has taken a small risk and is not quite certain of the reception. "Thank you," she said, finally. "It is nothing," he said. It was not nothing. They both knew it was not nothing. January in West Texas was cold and tight and gray, the sky pressing down on the caprock like a lid, the cattle huddled in the low places, and the hands moving through their work with extra layers and abbreviated conversation. The ranch house was warm, the kitchen especially, and Effie and James fell into the habit of sitting together in the evenings after supper, him with the accounts or the stock records and her with whatever she was reading or mending, the silence between them not empty but full of the kind of thing that does not yet have words. She was aware every day that she was living on borrowed time. She was aware every day that the thing building between them was a trap she was constructing for herself with every morning she stayed, and every evening she did not leave. She told herself she would tell him. She told herself she would find a way to explain about Abilene and Cole Draper and the trial and the record that had her name on it, and she would do it before anything happened that could not be undone. She told herself this, and she did not do it because she was afraid, and fear was something Effie Dugan had fought all her life but never quite managed to defeat. The thing that could not be undone happened in February. It was a Sunday, which was the one day the hands took as their own, and the ranch was quiet. James had been away to town and came back in the afternoon with a look about him that she had learned to read, a kind of held energy, as if he had made a decision or was about to. She was in the kitchen making bread, and the smell of it filled the whole ground floor of the house, and he came in and stood in the doorway for a moment not saying anything, and she turned around and looked at him, and the sunlight was coming through the west window and catching the flower dust in the air between them, and it was one of those moments that she would remember precisely for the rest of her life. "I need to say something to you," he said. "Then say it," she said, because she had learned that James Keene responded well to directness. "I have been trying to determine the right way to conduct myself," he said, with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed something and is now slightly off script. "Given that you are employed by me, which makes the situation complicated, and I want to be clear that nothing I am about to say should be taken as pressure of any kind." "James," she said. "I am trying to say this properly," he said. "You are," she said. "Keep going." He looked at her with those level gray eyes. "I think about you constantly," he said. "And I want to know if that is entirely on my side or whether you have any feeling that resembles it." She could have said no. She could have said it cleanly, and it would have hurt them both, and perhaps she would have gathered herself and left, and the thing that came in the mail 6 months later would never have had the chance to undo everything. She could have. She stood there in the warmth of the kitchen with flour on her hands and the bread rising behind her, and she looked at James Keene and she said, "It is not entirely on your side." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and he took her face in his hands the way a careful man handles something he recognizes as valuable, and he kissed her once slowly, and she let herself have it with every desperate, greedy inch of her heart, and that was the beginning of the thing that was going to have to survive everything that was coming. They were not reckless after that. They were deliberate and careful in the way of 2 people who understand that what they are building deserves to be built right. James was respectful of the proprieties, and she was grateful for this both because she valued them herself, and because the hands on the ranch would have opinions, and the town would have opinions, and she was still very conscious of the fact that she was carrying a secret that would change everything when it came out. She told herself again that she would tell him. She kept the telling in front of her like a task she was going to get to, and every day she did not do it, the task became heavier and harder to approach. In March, he asked her to marry him. They were out by the south fence looking at the early spring grass coming in, the light long and golden in the late afternoon, and he simply turned to her and asked, and she looked out over the land that she had come to love with the kind of love that surprises you, the land and the man both, and she said, "James, I need to tell you something before you ask me that." "Then tell me," he said. She told him some of it. She told him about Cole Draper, the man she had met in Abilene when she was 22 and working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods concern. She told him Cole had been charming and certain, and that she had trusted him the way young people trust people who seem to know where they are going. She told him Cole had been involved in a scheme involving land fraud and forged documents, and that when the law came for him, he had included her name in a way that suggested she had known and cooperated. She told him she had been released, but that her name had been in the Abilene papers, and she did not know who might have read them or remembered. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him about the year she had spent afterward working in circumstances she was ashamed of, the desperate year between the trial, and when she had finally gotten herself stable enough to move on. She did not tell him about the man who had helped her during that year, and what that help had cost her, and what she still owed from it. She held those pieces back because they were the pieces that felt most like proof that she was the kind of person she was afraid he would conclude she was. James listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the grass. "Is there more?" he said. She hesitated. "There are things I am not proud of," she said, "things from the year after. Are they things that harmed someone else who did not deserve it?" She thought about this carefully and honestly. "No," she said, "they are things that harmed me." He nodded slowly. "Then I still want to marry you," he said, "but I want you to know that you can tell me the rest when you are ready. I am not asking you to be uncontained all at once. I am just asking you to choose me the way I am choosing you." She should have loved him perfectly for this. She almost did. The part of her that was still afraid said, "He does not know the whole picture, wait, be careful." And she listened to that part when she should have listened to the other part, the part that was saying, "This man is real, give him the real you." She said yes. He put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, a thin gold band set with a small turquoise stone, and she wore it and thought about it every time she saw it, the weight of what she had not said pressing against the joy of what they were building. The spring was the most contented she had been since before Abilene. The wedding was planned for early June. The hands were quietly respectful, and the cook hired on extra help, so that Effie would not be burdened by the domestic work in the way she had been. The town of Harlow Creek had its opinions, naturally, and there were women at the Baptist church who communicated their doubts about Effie Dugan in the careful coded language of women who mean to be unkind while maintaining the surface appearance of concern. But there were also women who were warm and genuine, and she began, cautiously, to make friends. James was attentive without being smothering. He included her in the running of the ranch in ways that were practical and real, not performative. He asked her to keep the accounts, which was what she had been trained for, and she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and this competence felt like something solid to stand on. She let herself believe, for weeks at a time, that the thing she had not told him would simply stay buried. People reinvented themselves constantly in the West. That was supposed to be part of what it offered. Then the letter arrived. She knew something was wrong when she saw James's face at breakfast on that Tuesday morning in early May, 2 weeks before the wedding was to take place. He had gone to get the mail from Prout the afternoon before, and she had been busy with arrangements and had not paid attention to his return, and so she had not seen his face until the morning. He was at the table with the coffee already poured, which was unusual since she normally made it, and the letter was in front of him on the table, opened. She stopped in the doorway. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "Who sent it?" she said. "There is no signature," he said. She sat down and he pushed the letter across to her and she read it. It was short and precise and thorough. It covered everything she had told him and several things she had not, including the name of the establishment she had worked at in the desperate year after Abilene, which was a gambling parlor in a town called Denton, where she had dealt cards for a man named Harlan Voss, because it was the only work available to a woman whose name was in the newspaper connected to a fraud trial. It mentioned Harlan Voss specifically. It mentioned that she had been, in the language of the letter, in his personal employ in a capacity that extended beyond professional. This was a lie, or mostly a lie, or the kind of lie that is constructed from one true piece and many false ones, which was the most dangerous kind. Harlan Voss had made proposals to her that she had refused. He had then made her life difficult enough that she had left. The letter made it sound like something else entirely. She put the letter down. She looked at James. "It is not entirely accurate," she said. "Tell me which parts," he said. She told him. She told him about Harlan Voss and Denton, and the gambling parlor, and the proposals she had refused, and the way she had left. She told him all of it, all the pieces she had been holding back, her hands flat on the table and her voice steady, because if there was a time to be steady it was now, when everything was on the line. She felt exposed in the way she had not felt since she stood in that courthouse gallery and heard her name read aloud in connection with things she had not done. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "All of it. I was afraid." "I know," he said. "The letter is meant to ruin you," she said. "Whoever sent it wants the association with my name to damage what you have here. The land, the business, the standing you have with the other ranchers. Harlow Creek will hear about this. The letter will not be the only one." "Probably not," he said. She stood up. She was already calculating. She could be at the stage line by noon if she packed quickly and took the road on foot. She had money. She had the months of pay she had saved. She had done this before, the leaving, the starting over, and she could do it again even though something in her chest felt like it was being split open with a dull tool. "I will go," she said. "I will not let my past ruin what you have built." And that was when James Keene stood up from his chair and said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has already made his decision and is not going to be moved from it, "My past will ruin you," she said. And he looked at her across that table in the early morning light and said, "Then let it try. I am not afraid. She stared at him. Sit down, Effie, he said gently. James, sit down. She sat. Her legs were honestly a little unsteady, which she would not have admitted to anyone. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table in the way he did when he was about to say something he meant completely. I am going to tell you what I think, he said. You were 22 years old and a man deceived you. You survived a trial that had no right to include your name. You survived the year after it by doing work that was legal and that you conducted with integrity under circumstances that were not fair to you. None of that is a secret to be ashamed of. All of it is a story of a woman who kept going when most people would have quit. She did not trust herself to speak. The letter, he said, was written by someone who wants me afraid of you. And I am telling you, and I am telling whoever sent that letter if they care to hear it, that I am not afraid. What I know about you is what I have seen for 7 months in this house. You are honest and you are capable and you are kinder than you let people see, and you are the person I want to spend my life with. No piece of paper is going to change that. You say that now, she said, and her voice was rough. I will say it in 6 months and I will say it in 6 years, he said. The question is whether you are going to let me. She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming full through the east window now, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and the spring air coming under the door. And outside, one of the hands was already moving around in the yard, and the cattle were making their low morning sounds in the south pasture. All of it felt so solid and so terribly fragile at once. There are people in this county who will use what is in that letter, she said. Yes, he said, and we will deal with them. It could cost you contracts. The other ranchers know me, he said, and the ones who would turn on me over a letter with no signature are not the ones I need. She took a breath. And the wedding, she said. 2 weeks from Saturday, he said. Nothing has changed. She put her hands over her face for a moment, not crying exactly, but doing something that was adjacent to it, something that was a release of a pressure that had been building for months, and then she took her hands down and looked at him. All right, she said. All right, he said, and picked up his coffee. They were not naive, either of them, about what was coming. The anonymous letter was, as Effie had predicted, not the last of its kind. Within the week there was a second letter, this one addressed to Burl Hastings, who was the largest neighboring rancher and who had business dealings with James that involved shared grazing rights on a parcel between their 2 spreads. Effie did not see this letter, but she heard about it from James, who had heard about it from Hastings himself, who had come to the ranch with the expression of a man arriving to deliver news he was not sure how to frame. Hastings was a big, slow-moving man in his 50s, with the kind of mustache that suggested he had opinions about the dignity of mustaches. He sat in the front room of the ranch house and looked at his hat, while he explained that he had received correspondence that alleged certain things about James Keene's intended, and that he felt it was his duty as a neighbor and a business associate to raise the matter directly. James, who had invited Effie to sit in on this conversation deliberately, listened to Hastings finish and then said, Have you ever known me to be a dishonorable man, Burl? No, Hastings said. Have you ever known me to make a decision about my personal life that was impulsive or poorly considered? No, Hastings said, though he was starting to look uncomfortable. Then consider that I know the woman I am marrying, James said. I know her history. I know the parts that were difficult and the parts that were unfair to her and the parts she is proud of. I am not asking you to approve of my choice. I am asking you to trust my judgment the way I have trusted yours across 10 years of doing business together. Hastings was quiet for a while. He looked at Effie, who looked back at him steadily. She had decided some time in the previous sleepless night that she was not going to look away from anyone in this town. She was done with looking away. Miss Dugan, Hastings said finally, I have daughters. I know, she said. I would want a man to give them the benefit of the doubt, he said. Yes, she said. I imagine you would. He looked at his hat again. All right, he said. I will not be moved by anonymous letters. After he left, James looked at her. That is one, he said. There will be others, she said. Yes, he said, but we will not get to them by worrying about them in advance. Come look at the south pasture with me. The grass is coming in well. She laughed. She had not expected to, but she did, a real laugh surprised out of her, and he looked at her with the particular expression he got when she laughed, as if she had given him something he was planning to keep. They walked out to the south pasture in the late morning sun, and she felt, tentatively, dangerously, as if the ground under her feet might actually hold. The person who had sent the letters turned out to be, as they discovered several days before the wedding, a woman named Matilda Grundy, who ran the ladies' sewing circle at the Baptist church, and who had, it emerged, harbored hopes regarding James Keene that she had never openly expressed, but that had, over the years, solidified into a proprietary feeling that Effie's arrival had threatened. Matilda had a second cousin in Abilene. Second cousins were, in the West, enough of a connection to get someone to look up newspaper archives. Effie learned this from Rachel Prout, the storekeeper's wife, who was one of the women in town who had been genuinely warm to her, and who arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning with a pie and information delivered in the practical tone of a woman who believes in giving people what they need without excessive ceremony. Matilda Grundy sent those letters, Rachel said, putting the pie on the kitchen table. She told Dory Vance, who cannot keep a confidence, and Dory told me. I thought you should know. Does James know? Effie said. I expect you will tell him, Rachel said. The cherry preserves in that pie are from last year's crop. They came out well, Effie told James that evening. He sat with it for a while without saying much, and then he said, I'm going to speak to Earl Bolden. The sheriff, Effie said. Sending anonymous letters designed to damage a person's reputation may not be a criminal matter, he said, but Earl can have a conversation with Matilda Grundy that makes clear that the letter writing needs to stop. I would rather do this quietly than make it a public dispute. She will not stop otherwise, Effie said. No, he agreed. She will not. Sheriff Earl Bolden was, as established, a man who operated on the principle of what was easiest for Earl Bolden. And the easiest thing in this case was clearly to be on the side of James Keene, who was the most significant landowner in the county, and who held notes on several pieces of land that could, theoretically, cause complications for people who were not in his good graces. Bolden visited Matilda Grundy, and whatever he said to her, the letters stopped, and Matilda Grundy stopped attending the sewing circle for several months, and the matter was not spoken of publicly, which suited everyone except possibly Matilda Grundy, who had no advocates in this particular outcome. Effie felt something settle in her after this. Not complete safety. She was realistic about the fact that complete safety was not something this life offered, but a kind of functional stability, the knowledge that what had been sent to wound her had not succeeded in its purpose, and that the man she was marrying had handled it with more grace and effectiveness than she could have managed on her own. She told James, 2 days before the wedding, that she loved him. She had not said it yet. She was aware that she had not said it and that he had not said it, and that they had been operating in a space where the actions said what the words had not yet been spoken aloud, and she thought it was time to correct this. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, the sky going rose and copper over the west, the cattle sounds settling for the night and the first stars beginning to appear in the east, and she simply said, I love you, James. He turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the one she had seen at Christmas when he gave her the book, that careful neutrality that was not actually neutral at all. That was a man trying to contain a feeling that was too large to be held completely still. I was beginning to think you might never say it, he said. I was afraid to, she said. I seem to have spent a significant portion of my life being afraid of things I should not have been afraid of. Then I will tell you, he said, so that it is said clearly and on record between us. I love you, Effie Dugan. I have loved you since November, if I am being precise about it. It has been a considerable effort maintaining appropriate reserve. She laughed again, that surprised laugh, and he took her hand and they sat together while the stars came out over West Texas, and she felt something that she did not have a word for, something that was bigger than contentment and more complicated than happiness, something that felt like arriving. They were married on the second Saturday of June, 1879, in the Baptist Church of Harlow Creek, Texas. Reverend Moorfield performed the ceremony in a building full of people who had, for the most part, decided that James Keene's judgment was worth trusting, and that Effie Dugan was a woman who had earned her place in this community. Rachel Prout was there with her husband and their 3 children. Burl Hastings was there with his wife, who had apparently decided that her husband's endorsement was enough for her. The hands from the ranch were in the back pews, scrubbed and uncomfortable looking in their best clothes, and James's foreman, a quiet, competent man named Davis, stood up as witness. Effie wore a dress of blue wool that Rachel had helped her make over the previous weeks, altered from a dress Effie had bought in San Antonio years ago and kept in the bottom of her carpet bag, the way one keeps things that were meant for a better occasion. Her hair was pinned up with pearl pins that had been Rachel's gift, and she carried a small bunch of the late spring wildflowers that grew along the caprock edge. James, in a dark coat and clean white shirt, looked at her when she came down the aisle with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck, and she felt the same thing looking back at him. They said their vows. The words of the 1879 Episcopal rite were words about love and honor and keeping, and she said them and meant every syllable. And when he put his mother's ring properly on her finger, she felt the weight of it as something she had earned, the right to be here, the right to be loved by this careful and steadfast man. The celebration afterward at the ranch was simple and generous. The cook, whose name was a Mexican man everyone called Montoya, had prepared a meal that was extraordinary by any standard, and there was music from 2 of the hands who played fiddle and guitar, and there was dancing on the packed earth of the yard in the long summer evening, and Effie danced with James until her feet ached, and she did not care even a little. Late in the evening, when the fire in the yard was burning low and most of the guests had drifted home, and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse with their various confidences maintained, James and Effie stood alone by the fire for a while, his arm around her, and she leaned into him and felt the warmth of him against the cooling night air. "I need to tell you something," she said. "What is it?" he said, in the attentive way he always had when she said something with that particular weight in her voice. "I was going to leave that morning," she said. "The morning with the letter, I was already packed. I had been awake since 4 and I had my bag and I was going to leave before you woke up so that you would not be able to argue with me." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You knew. Your bag was by the kitchen door when I came down," he said. "I moved it before I made the coffee." She looked up at him. "You moved it. I was not going to make it easy for you to leave," he said. "Is that a confession I should be embarrassed by?" "No," she said firmly. "It is not." He pressed his mouth to her hair. She closed her eyes and let the fire warm her face, and the sky above them was enormous and full of stars, the kind of sky that makes everything feel both very small and very significant at the same time. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that tests what has been built. There was a drought in July and August that put pressure on the cattle operation and required difficult decisions about water rights and herd management that James navigated with the methodical care that characterized everything he did. Effie kept the accounts during this period with the rigor of someone who has been in financial uncertainty and knows what vigilance costs when you lack it, and her precision with the numbers helped James make several decisions about selling portions of the herd at the right time that other ranchers, less well-informed about their own financial position, made too late. There was also the matter of a man who arrived in Harlow Creek in September. His name was Cole Draper. She recognized him before he recognized her. She was at Prout's store, picking up a supply order, when she looked up from the counter and saw him coming through the door, and everything in her went still in the way it goes still when you see a thing you hoped was entirely in the past. Cole Draper was 40 now, which put 10 years between them, and those 10 years had not been kind to him. He was thinner than she remembered, and his eyes had that watchful, lateral quality that spoke of a man who is always calculating the exits. He was dressed decently enough, the kind of decent that was carefully assembled rather than natural, and he had a short beard that he had not had in Abilene. He saw her a moment after she saw him. She watched the recognition cross his face, followed immediately by the calculation. "Effie Dugan," he said, "I will be damned." "My name is Effie Keene now," she said, with a steadiness she was genuinely proud of. "I would like you to remember that." "Keene," he said, as in James Keene, the big rancher. He was smiling, and the smile was the thing she had once been taken in by and could now see clearly for what it was, a tool rather than an expression. "Is that right? Well, it is a small world." "What are you doing in Harlow Creek?" she said. "Passing through," he said. "Just passing through." She did not believe him. She paid for her supplies and left, and she went directly to the ranch, and she told James everything, including things she had already told him and some details she had clarified in her own mind over the intervening months. She was not going to have Cole Draper show up in this town and have James hear about it from someone else. James listened with the thoroughness he always brought to information that required action. "Does he know where the ranch is?" he said. "He knows your name," she said. "That is enough." "All right," James said. "I am going to ride into town." "James." "I am not going to do anything dramatic," he said, with the particular dry note that passed for humor in his communication. "I am going to introduce myself to the man who caused you considerable harm and let him understand clearly that he is not welcome to cause any further harm. That is all." She watched him saddle his horse and ride out, and she stood on the porch and felt the particular acute anxiety of a woman who has put everything she loves in a position where it could be taken from her, and also, underneath that, a deep and strange feeling that she identified after a moment as something very close to peace. Not because the situation was not dangerous. It was. But because she was not alone in it. James found Cole Draper at the Gilded Spur Saloon, which was exactly where a man like Cole Draper would be found. He sat down across from him and he said, calmly and without elevation of tone, that he was James Keene, that Effie Keene was his wife, that what Cole Draper had done in Abilene was a matter of record and character, and that if Cole Draper remained in Harlow Creek longer than it took to conduct whatever legitimate business had brought him there, James would have Sheriff Bolden look very carefully at Cole Draper's current activities, which given the man's history seemed unlikely to be entirely clean. Cole Draper left Harlow Creek the next morning. Effie learned all of this from James over supper that evening, told in the same tone he used for ranch business, practical and matter of fact, and she looked at him across the table and felt the love she had for him as something physical, a warmth in her sternum that spread outward. "You are not going to say it was unnecessary," she said. "It was entirely necessary," he said. The man needed to understand the situation. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me for that," he said. "That was simply being a husband." She thought about this for a moment. "I spent a long time believing that being protected was not something I could ask for," she said. "That I had to manage everything alone because I had been the one to make the choices that put me in difficult situations. Some of those choices were made for you," he said, "and some of them were survival, and none of them mean you should not have someone in your corner." She nodded slowly, still getting used to the truth of it. By the following spring, Effie realized she was carrying their first child. She recognized the signs before she was certain, and she kept the knowledge to herself for a week, not from secrecy but from a private, wondering feeling. The need to hold the knowledge alone for a little while before it became shared and real in the way that shared things become real. She was 27 years old, and she was married to a man she loved in a house that was hers, and she was, against every prediction she had made for herself in the years after Abilene, going to be a mother. She told James on a Sunday morning in April over breakfast. She said simply, "I am expecting a baby." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. His face did the thing she had learned to watch for, that process of containing a feeling too large for neutral expression. And then he stood up and came around the table and he took her hands and he said, "When?" "October, I think," she said. "Perhaps November." He sat down beside her, still holding her hands, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Outside, the spring wind was moving through the grass and the sky was the particular clear blue that came with the Texas spring, and somewhere in the yard a mockingbird was going through its full repertoire at considerable volume. "Are you afraid?" he said. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A great deal," he said, "and very happy." "Those are not contradictory," she said. "No," he said, "they are not." The pregnancy was healthy, and Effie was practical about it in the way she was practical about most things, continuing to manage the accounts and the household well into the summer, accepting help when it was offered from Rachel Prout and from Davis's wife, a steady woman named Clara who had 3 children of her own and a reliable manner about the whole business of having them. James was attentive without being anxious, which was the exact right calibration, checking on her genuinely and without hovering, and he was, she noticed, systematically reading everything he could find about the subject in the way that James Keene approached anything he wanted to do well. The baby was born in late October, on a Thursday with a cold front coming in, delivered with the help of Clara Davis and a doctor who rode out from the nearest town, a capable man named Dr. Asapel, who had been practicing on the frontier long enough to be unrattled by anything. The labor was hard and long, and at certain points Effie was more frightened than she had been in years, but she was also, in some part of herself, furiously determined, and when the baby came it came with a healthy and indignant announcement of itself that filled the room. "It is a boy," Dr. Pell said. She heard James in the hallway, a sound she had never heard from him before, and recognized it as the sound a person makes when relief and joy arrive simultaneously and neither will wait for the other. They named him Thomas William Keene. Thomas for James's father and William because Effie had loved the name since childhood, and this was a small private victory she allowed herself. Thomas arrived in the world with dark hair that would eventually lighten, and his father's gray eyes, and a disposition that was, from the very beginning, attentive and considering, the kind of disposition that made people say, later, that he had been born watching and thinking. James held his son for the first time with the careful, reverent grip of a man handling something that has entirely rearranged his understanding of what matters. He looked at Effie over the baby's head, and the expression on his face was one she would carry for the rest of her life, a look of complete and unqualified love, not just for the child but for her, for what they had made together out of all the difficult and unlikely materials their lives had given them. "He is perfect," James said. "He is loud," Effie said with enormous tenderness. "He is perfectly loud," James said. Winter closed around the ranch, and the 3 of them settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, which were demanding in the way all genuinely important things are demanding, and James adjusted his schedule with the same thoughtful practicality he brought to everything, rising for the early morning feeding on alternate nights so that Effie could sleep, and she accepted this help without guilt for the first time in her adult life and recognized the acceptance as its own form of growth. The following years were full in the way that good lives are full. Thomas grew from a watching, thoughtful infant into a walking, then running, then climbing boy with strong opinions about horses and a stubbornness that was so obviously inherited from both parents that James and Effie would look at each other during Thomas's more determined moments with a helpless shared recognition that was one of the private languages of their marriage. He was 3 when Effie became pregnant again, and this time she told James the same evening she was certain, not waiting her private week, because she was no longer the woman who held everything alone or trying not to be. This baby was a girl, born in the summer of 1883, when Thomas was 3 years old and the ranch had expanded considerably and was running more cattle than ever before, the operation now employing 12 hands through the summer season and James's reputation in the county having survived, thoroughly, whatever damage the anonymous letters of 1879 had been intended to do. They named the girl Lucy Ann Keene, Lucy for James's mother and Anne, because it suited her from the moment she arrived, which she did with considerably more serenity than her brother, looking around the room with large dark eyes that were clearly Effie's and a small serious expression that made the doctor smile. Thomas was, after an initial period of profound suspicion, enchanted by his sister. He developed the habit of sitting beside her with one hand resting gently on her back, as if keeping her in place, and this habit persisted as they both grew older, the protective attention of an older sibling that is also a kind of love. In the summer of 1884, 5 years after their wedding, James and Effie had one of the evenings that neither of them planned for, but that became one of the reference points of their life together. Thomas was 4 and Lucy was almost a year old, and both children had been put down for the night, and the house was quiet in the deep summer darkness, and James and Effie were on the porch with the stars overhead, which was where they often ended up in the warm months. "I have been thinking," James said. "About what?" "About the ranch," he said. "There is a section to the north that adjoins the Hastings land that I have the option to purchase. It would be a significant expansion. It would also require a significant investment." "I know," she said. "I have run the numbers 3 times." He turned to look at her. "And it is the right move if we do it in 2 stages," she said. "Purchase the north section this year when the prices are reasonable, and hold the development costs until the next spring when the cattle revenue from the expanded fall drive comes in. It requires 3 months of operating on a tighter margin than you are comfortable with, but the numbers hold." He was looking at her with the expression that was one of her favorites, which was the expression of a man who is reminded, freshly and with pleasure, exactly who he is married to. "You have the figures for the 2-stage approach," he said. "I will show them to you in the morning," she said. "It is too dark to look at a ledger right now." "I could light a lamp," he said. "You're staying on the porch," she said. "Look at the stars, James." He looked at the stars. After a moment he reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in the warm Texas darkness while the ranch breathed around them, the soft movements of the cattle in the far pasture and the night insects and the steady, reliable darkness of the Caprock sky. "I need to tell you something," he said after a while. She waited. "I think about that morning sometimes," he said. "The morning with the letter." "So do I," she said. "I think about what would have happened if you had gone," he said. "If you had made it out the door before I came downstairs." She was quiet because she thought about this too sometimes in the private hours. "You would have managed," she said finally. "You were managing before I arrived." "I was functioning," he said. "That is different from managing. I had the ranch and the land and the work, and I was functioning well enough. But I was not." He paused, searching for the word with the careful precision he brought to important things. "I was not alive in the way I have been since you came." She looked at him. The starlight was enough to see his face, and what was on it was simply the truth, stated with the directness that had always been one of the things she loved most about him, the refusal to dress things up in any way that would make them less precise. "I feel the same," she said. "For what it is worth, I feel the exact same." "It is worth a great deal," he said. The north section was purchased the following month, and the 2-stage development proceeded exactly as Effie had projected. And by the following spring, the Keene Ranch was the largest operation in the county, with the kind of financial stability that comes not from luck, but from years of careful, well-informed decision-making. James gave Effie full credit for the financial strategy at the meeting of the local cattle association, where the expansion was discussed, naming her by name and by contribution, and she sat in that room and received it with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was visible and legitimate and unreservedly proud. There were still the occasional sideways looks. There were still women at the church who maintained their complicated feelings about Effie Keene née Dugan, who had come from somewhere unspecified, and who had a history that people in small towns never entirely forgot. She had made her peace with this mostly. Not the complete peace that comes from indifference, but the functional peace that comes from knowing that the people who matter have made their judgment, and that judgment is not against her. Rachel Prout remained her closest friend in Harlow Creek, and this friendship, quiet and practical and full of the particular warmth of women who trust each other completely, was something she valued beyond what she could easily articulate. They had coffee together most Tuesday mornings when Effie came into town for supplies, and they talked about their children and their husbands, and the news that came through the post, and the state of the territory, and the 1,000 ordinary things that make up the texture of a life. And this, too, was part of what she had not known she could have, and was now so thoroughly grateful for. Thomas started school at the town schoolhouse in 1885, which was operated by a teacher who had come out from the East with a vigorous sense of educational mission and a great deal of Latin. And Thomas took to schooling with the same watching, absorbing attention he brought to everything, and came home full of information that he delivered to his parents at supper, with the urgency of a boy who has discovered that the world is larger than he thought and needs everyone to know it. Lucy, who was 2 by then, watched her brother's reports from the height of her chair with large eyes and the particular expression of a child who is filing everything away, and James looked at Effie over both their heads, sometimes with the expression that said, "We made these people. Look at them," which was a feeling that had not diminished 1 degree since Thomas was first born. In 1886, Effie was pregnant again, a fact she discovered in the spring, and announced to James with the directness that had become their standard, which he received with the warmth that had also become their standard. And this baby arrived in the autumn, a boy they named Henry James Keene, which was James's full name given forward 1 generation, a thing James said he did not require but clearly felt deeply when she proposed it. Henry was different from the beginning in the way that 3rd children are often different, arriving into a household already established, with older siblings who were both delighted and intermittently territorial. He was a sunny, physical child from very early on, crawling then walking with an enthusiasm for speed that contrasted sharply with Thomas's measured watchfulness and Lucy's serene observation, and James said dryly that Henry was making up for the temperament that neither of his siblings had brought. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one with its texture and its trials, and its particular moments of joy or difficulty, or the ordinary fullness of a life being actually lived. There was the hard winter of 1887 that tested the cattle operation severely, and from which they emerged diminished but intact, partly because of Effie's insistence the previous year on building their cash reserve rather than reinvesting everything, a caution that James had mildly questioned at the time and did not question after the winter was done. There was the year Thomas turned 10 and began working alongside his father on the ranch in the way of boys in cattle country, learning the land with his hands and his feet, and the particular pride James took in his son's serious attention to the work was a thing that made Effie love both of them more acutely than she could express. There was the summer Lucy decided she wanted to learn to ride properly rather than being led around on the gentle mare that had been her first horse, and the subsequent weeks of negotiation between her parents regarding the appropriate age and supervision level for a 6-year-old on an actual horse, which Effie won on the grounds that 6 years old with proper supervision was entirely reasonable, and that James's caution, while loving, was going to result in a daughter who could not ride, and that seemed a waste. There was the evening in the spring of 1889 when James came in from the south pasture with a look she recognized, that held energy look that meant he had something to say, and he sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I had a conversation today with Burl Hastings." "About?" she said, not looking up from the accounts. "He is thinking of retiring," James said. "He is in his 60s now and his sons want to run the operation and he is ready to step back. He asked me if I knew anyone who might be interested in his second parcel, the eastern section. He would price it fairly for someone he trusted." She looked up, How many acres? 4,000. She set down her pen. She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady gray gaze, and she knew from it that he had already run his own preliminary numbers and that they were likely to agree with whatever she came to, but that he was asking her because he always asked her, because this was how they worked, two minds on every significant decision, 10 years of it now, each of them knowing how the other thought and trusting both their thinking and their character. "I will look at the ledgers tonight," she said. "I know you will," he said. "Make me coffee," she said. He made the coffee and sat across from her while she worked through the numbers, which was how it had always been and always would be. Him present and quiet and trusting while she worked. Her aware of him in a way that was both comfortable and still, after 10 years, full of the feeling she had first recognized in that kitchen in October of 1878 and had been trying to get used to ever since. They purchased the Hastings Eastern section in the summer of 1889, and the Keene Ranch became not merely the largest operation in the county, but one of the larger cattle operations in West Texas, a fact that was noted in the Harlow Creek paper, with an account that referred to James Keene as a man whose business acumen and character had made him a central figure in the development of the region, and to his wife, Effie Keene, as a woman whose capabilities in the management of the ranch's finances had been integral to its growth. She read this and read it again, quietly in the kitchen, and then folded the paper and put it on the table and went about her morning. And if her eyes were a little bright for a bit, only James saw it, and he did not say anything, only put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, which was enough. Thomas was 19 years old in 1893, a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's analytical mind and a deep love for the land that was his inheritance. He had finished his schooling and come fully onto the ranch and was a genuine part of the operation in his own right, capable and thoughtful, and James trusted his son's judgment in the way he trusted Effie's, with the recognition of a quality he knew well because he had watched it develop from its first expression. Lucy was 12, and at school and reading everything she could find and talking about teaching, which Effie encouraged completely. Henry was 7, and had not yet found the direction of his enthusiasm, except that it was large and noisy, and needed a great deal of outdoor space. In the fall of 1893, something happened that brought the past back one final time. A man arrived in Harlow Creek who said he was a journalist from a San Antonio paper, working on a series of pieces about the development of the cattle industry in West Texas. His name was Samuel Burke, and he was in his 30s, and he had a professional manner and a notebook, and he was making the rounds of the significant ranch operations in the area. He came to the Keene Ranch on a Tuesday in October with a letter of introduction from the county newspaper and a request for an interview with James Keene. James agreed to the interview, and he included Effie in it, which the journalist found interesting and made note of, the way the rancher deferred to his wife on questions of financial strategy and operation management, with what was clearly genuine respect rather than performed courtesy. Midway through the interview, the journalist said, with the practiced casualness of a man who thinks he is being subtle, "Mrs. Keene, I understand you came to Harlow Creek from the Abilene area originally." She looked at him. She looked at James, who had turned his head slightly, not toward her in alarm, but toward the journalist with the particular quality of attention that signaled the conversation had taken a turn he was noting. "I came through Abilene," she said evenly, "years ago." "Were you in Abilene during the Draper fraud case?" he said. "That was a significant case at the time. I am compiling a history of the period." She was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the October light on the grass, and the cattle grazing in the east pasture, and the sky that was the deep clear blue of high autumn in Texas. She looked at Thomas, who was in the yard visible through the window, loading a wagon with the calm efficiency of his father. She thought about the girl she had been at 22 in Abilene, the girl who had trusted the wrong person and paid for it, and the woman she was now at 41, sitting in the house she had helped build, in the life she had helped build, in a marriage that had survived every attempt to unmake it. "Yes," she said. "My name appears in the record of that case. I was released without charge. I was not involved in what Cole Draper did." She said it plainly, without apology, and she held the journalist's gaze and she did not look away. He wrote something in his notebook. "Thank you for your candor, Mrs. Keene," he said. "The article," James said, "will represent what is accurate. If it represents otherwise, I will be in contact with the editor directly." The journalist looked at James. James looked back with the complete equanimity of a man who has 30 years of weather and 42,000 acres and a track record that speaks for itself, and the journalist said, "Of course, Mr. Keene. Of course." The article, when it appeared several weeks later, described the Keene Ranch as one of the great success stories of the West Texas cattle industry, with a detailed and respectful account of the operation's growth and the partnership between James and Effie Keene that had driven it. Effie's past was not mentioned. Whether this was because the journalist had decided it was not relevant or because he had weighed the implications of James Keene's measured warning, she did not know and did not need to. What she knew was that she had said it plainly and without flinching, and it had not killed her. The saying had, in fact, been smaller than the years of not saying. This was a lesson she filed away and thought she would carry the rest of her life. That evening she told James what she had felt in the moment, doing the thing she had learned to do across 15 years of marriage, which was to tell him the truth of what was happening inside her rather than presenting only the composed surface. "I was not afraid," she said. "Or I was a little, but it was a small fear this time." "You sounded composed," he said. "I was mostly composed," she said, with a small undercurrent of terror. "You looked magnificent," he said, entirely sincerely. She laughed, the genuine laugh that he could still surprise out of her after all this time, and he looked at her with the expression she had first seen at Christmas in 1878, and that had not changed in 15 years, the expression of a man who is given something he intends to keep. And she thought, as she often thought at moments like this, about that morning in the kitchen with the letter and the packed bag by the door and the impossibility of what he had offered her. "Then let it try," she said softly, mostly to herself. He looked at her. He understood what she was referencing. "I told you," he said. "You did," she said. "You were right." "I usually am," he said, with the dry note she had loved since November of 1878. "That is an enormous overstatement," she said. "I am right about the things that matter," he said more quietly. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "you are." Thomas married in 1895, a girl named Susan Darrow, who was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and who had her own competence and her own strong opinions, and who met Effie with the careful, sizing-up attention of a young woman trying to understand the family she was marrying into. Effie liked her immediately and told James so, and James said he had liked her since the first time he watched her correct Thomas's assessment of a piece of land and be entirely right about it. The wedding was at the ranch in the summer, and it was beautiful, and Effie danced with her son and felt the overwhelming complexity of watching a person you have loved since before they could walk take their first step into their own life. Lucy, who was 14 by now, watched the wedding with the expression of a girl who is making notes. She had announced the previous year that she planned to go east for her teacher's training, and this plan had been met by James with initial hesitation and by Effie with complete support, which was the dynamic that generally prevailed when the question was about expanding their children's options rather than limiting them. Henry was 9 and had found his direction, which turned out to be horses, with the consuming intensity of a boy who has discovered his native element. He was already known among the ranch hands as the person to consult about an animal's temperament or condition, an instinctive understanding of horses that seemed to have arrived fully formed and required only experience to develop. In the summer of 1896, Effie and James celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary. The children organized a dinner, which was Thomas and Susan's idea, and Lucy helped with the cooking, which she was surprisingly good at despite her stated preference for literature over domesticity. And Henry ate everything with the focused efficiency he brought to activities he enjoyed. After dinner, when the children had retired to their various corners of the house or their own sleeping quarters, James and Effie sat on the porch in the summer dark, which was where they always ended up, the porch having been their place for their important conversations since the beginning. 17 years, she said. Yes, he said. When I came walking up that road in 1878, she said, I had everything I owned in a bag that weighed about 20 pounds. I was planning to be here for a month at most. I know, he said. Did you know then that you were going to want me to stay? He considered this with the care he brought to honest questions. I knew the third day, he said. When you told me that the man who trusted his judgment and was wrong had the information he needed for the next time, I thought, this is a person who thinks about things in a way I want to spend time near. She looked at him. The third day, she said. I am observant, he said. You are, she agreed. It took me somewhat longer. It took you until February, he said. I remember exactly. She put her head against his shoulder, which was something she did when she was tired or content or both, and he put his arm around her, which was something he did whenever she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the summer darkness of West Texas, the horses moving softly in the near pasture and the cattle settled and the stars overhead in their permanent, enormous arrangements, and everything that had ever threatened to undo them was somewhere far behind. And everything they had built was real and solid and true around them. James, she said. Yes, I am glad you moved the bag, she said. She felt him laugh, that quiet internal laugh that was the most contained and the most genuine of his expressions. So am I, he said. The years that followed had their ordinary textures and their extraordinary moments, as years do when they are being truly lived. Thomas and Susan had their first child in 1897, a boy they named James Thomas Keene, who made James a grandfather and produced in him a quality of delighted astonishment that Effie found entirely charming and told him so, to which he responded that grandparenthood was different from parenthood in a way he could not have predicted, and was not entirely sure he had the vocabulary for. You love him in a particular way, she said. I love all of them in a particular way, he said. Yes, she said, but this is the particular way of a man who does not have to be the person who maintains the discipline. That is a comfortable position. I am enjoying it, he admitted. Lucy left for teacher's training in 1897, at 16, which was on the younger end but not unheard of, and Effie saw her off at the stage line with the pride of a woman watching her daughter become something the frontier did not always give women room to become. Lucy wrote long, detail-filled letters that arrived irregularly and were read by the whole family over supper, and she came home in the summers and spent her visits reading and teaching Henry things he had not asked to know, but absorbed with the same thoroughness he brought to horses. Henry was 12 when Lucy left and was spending most of his waking hours with the horses in a way that had shifted from hobby to vocation, and James had begun talking to him seriously about the prospect of developing a horse breeding operation alongside the cattle ranch, which was something Henry received with the intensity of a boy whose ambitions have been named and recognized. Effie turned 45 in 1897, a fact she noted with the pragmatic interest she brought to most things about herself, and James, who was 50, brought her a gift that was a small framed map of their ranch property showing all the parcels as they had been acquired over the years, hand-drawn by a cartographer in Abilene who had been sent the dimensions and descriptions, and she sat with this map for a long time, tracing the lines of what they had built. It is not nothing, she said, which was what she had said about the Christmas book in 1878, the echo deliberate. He remembered. She could see that he remembered. It is not nothing, he agreed. She put the map on the wall of the study where the accounts were kept, where she could see it when she was working, and she looked at it often and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had been built rather than fallen into, built with intention and hard work, and two people who had chosen each other persistently across many years and many difficulties, and who intended to keep choosing each other. Lucy returned from her teacher's training in 1899, certified and full of plans, and took a position at the Harlow Creek schoolhouse, which pleased the community and delighted Reverend Moorfield, and meant that she was back in the orbit of the family, which pleased everyone including Lucy herself, who it turned out had missed the ranch and the plains and the enormous sky more than she had expected. Henry, at 14, had begun the horse breeding program in earnest with 2 mares and a stallion of the quarter horse line that was proving well suited to the cattle work, and his reputation for an eye with horses had spread beyond the ranch in the way of genuine expertise, which spreads by word of accomplishment rather than by word of mouth. In the autumn of 1900, on the last evening of the 19th century, James and Effie sat on the porch as they had on so many thousands of evenings, the air cold enough for their breath to show, and both of them wrapped in blankets, and they looked out at the land in the last dark of the century, and did not say anything for a long time. "Do you know what I think about?" she said finally. "Tell me," he said. "That morning," she said, "still sometimes I think about who I was going to be if I had made it to the road." "Who were you going to be?" he said. "Alone," she said simply. "I was going to be very much alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know you well enough then to know how much I would have lost," he said. "I only knew I was not going to let you walk away without saying what I meant." "What you said was perfect," she said. "It was the truth," he said. "It was brave," she said. "It was easy," he said. "Loving you has always been easy, Effie. It has been everything else that required courage." She turned and looked at him in the cold December dark, and he looked back at her, and she thought of the girl who had walked that road with her 20-pound bag and her fabricated story and her dark past carried like ballast in her chest. The girl who had told herself she would be gone before anything complicated could happen. And she thought of every year since then, the years of accounts and cattle and children and letters sent to wound her and answered with steadiness. The years of learning what it felt like to be loved by a person who knew your whole self and chose you anyway. And she thought that the word for all of it was not redemption exactly, though it was something in that family of words. The word was closer to homecoming. The word was closer to the feeling of a place that was always supposed to be yours and that you arrived at, finally, having taken the long route. "Then let it try," she said quietly to the dark and to him and to the years and to herself. James reached over and took her hand under the blanket, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat together as the last hours of the century ran down, and the stars wheeled overhead in their old and patient arrangements, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the children were asleep in their rooms, and the ranch was still and whole and entirely theirs, and everything that had once been dark in her life had been met by something that did not flinch from it, and in the meeting had been made bearable, and in the bearing had been made, slowly and permanently, into something she recognized as grace. Thomas came out in the morning with Susan and the baby, and Lucy came in from her small house near the school, and Henry came clattering out of the barn with news about one of the mares who had foaled in the night, a healthy colt with good lines, and the first day of the new century unfolded around the Keene family like any other good morning, full of work and food and voices, and the particular noise of a household that is firmly, happily occupied with being alive. Effie stood in the kitchen and made breakfast for all of them, and listened to the layers of conversation, and the baby's sounds and Henry's enthusiastic report about the colt and Lucy correcting something Henry had read wrong about horse breeding from a technical manual, and Thomas saying something dry that made Susan laugh, and she felt James come to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly into him. "What are you thinking?" he said quietly against her hair. "That I want all of it," she said, "every last piece of it." "You have it," he said. She turned and looked at him, The man who had moved her bag so she could not leave, the man who had said let it try, the man who had given her back to herself by refusing to accept anything less than all of her. And she smiled, the full real smile that she had learned over 22 years was safe to give him. "I know," she said. "I know I have it." The morning light came through the east kitchen window, and the coffee was hot, and the baby was laughing at something Thomas was doing with his hat. And out in the barn Henry's new colt was taking its first uncertain steps on the caprock earth of West Texas. And the Keene ranch lay around them in the January sun. 400 acres grown to 40,000 grown to the life of a woman who had once been told her past would define her, and had been proven. By love and by time and by one steadfast man's unafraid heart, magnificently wrong.